Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Suzanne Rivera, Vice President for Research and Technology Management here at Case Western Reserve University. And before I begin, I'm going to preemptively apologize for the way I sound. I'm having a ferocious allergy attack just now. So I'll lower your expectations about my performance up front, and then I can only exceed them. I want to welcome those of you who are visitors to our campus. You picked a beautiful time of year to visit, and thank you for joining us here today for what promises to be a very stimulating panel. This session is focused on innovative models in university-industry partnerships. With our distinguished panelists, we'll be exploring the following themes. In what ways are partnerships between companies and universities changing? Or are they really changing? What innovative partnership models hold the most promise for new kinds of relationships between academia and industry? And what do we need to consider going forward? The format we'll use for this panel is that I will briefly introduce each panelist, and then they will present for no more than 10 minutes. And after all four panelists have presented, I will facilitate a question and answer period, during which you can submit your questions either by using the remesh technology or in the 20th century way by projecting your voice through a microphone by which we can all hear you. We're really excited about this remesh technology, though it was developed by a current Case Western Reserve PhD student, Aaron Slotoff, and remesh creates an interactive voice of the audience experience between attendees and speakers. And some of you have already seen it in action in other sessions of the conference. So to access it, you just go on the conference app, which I hope all of you have downloaded, choose the session you're in, and click on the link that will direct you to a website to join the conversation. And here you can enter questions you have for the speakers, or you can choose among the questions that other speakers have submitted and indicate that you also want to hear the answer to that one. Each session has its unique conversation link, which will be open during the session. And if we have any questions at all, we have an expert in the technology sitting here, and she can give you a hand. She's raising her hand right now. So let's go ahead and begin. Our first panelist today is Dr. Tony Boccanfuso. As president of the University Industry Demonstration Partnership, or UIDP, Tony is a leading expert on university-industry relations. He's a thought leader in print and on the speaker circuit, domestically and internationally. Tony also serves as a consultant for government agencies, nonprofit organizations, and corporations, and is the vice chair of the MedStar Health Research Institute. Tony holds a PhD in inorganic chemistry from the University of South Carolina and a BS in chemistry and political science from Furman University. And Tony and his family live in Connecticut, where Tony's wife, Dr. Laura Boccanfuso, is a social robotics researcher at Yale. Tony, will you kick us off?
Absolutely. So thank you, Sue, for having me here today, and it's great to see so many of you here. Sue didn't mention this, but I spent 4.5 years in Northwest Ohio at Bowling Green, so I was a Falcon. My wife is a graduate, got her master's in engineering, and my oldest daughter was born at Wood County Hospital in February of #97. So we have some roots here, and it's great to be back on campus here at your wonderful institution, so thank you for having me. So Sue mentioned briefly that I am president of a group called the University Industry Demonstration Partnership, which is an organization of the willing, as I like to describe it. We are 140 members strong. It's an institutional membership made up of companies and universities in the United States, including Case and Ohio State and Ohio University, and then lots and lots of others in the United States, and we're actually looking abroad. So we focus on trying to solve problems affecting collaborations between the sectors. So we're a skunkworks. We focus on practical solutions to real-world problems. Our start was looking at contracting issues. There was a study done back in the mid-2000 period where Dow looked at their entire portfolio of university engagement and found that it took sometimes up to 20 months to put in a research contract. And people said that's too long. There was a study called the Gathering Storm Report put out by the National Academies, which some of you may have heard, which basically said that university-industry collaborations are important to maintain our technology edge, and we need to make it better between the sectors. And so that's how we got our start. We've grown and evolved past that, but we bring together people like Sue and Joe Jankowski and Lisa Camp and others from companies to talk about issues affecting collaborations. And you know, I think that there are common issues that we see affecting collaborations. And you know, the real challenge is, how do we affect change? How do we do things that are bold, that are going to be substantive in terms of change? And I know this discussion is around models, so I thought what I'd do is maybe just give you a little flavor of some of the things that are going on domestically in the country. And then, obviously, I'll be pleased to answer questions after the other esteemed panelists talk about things. So let me just talk about some things that are going on that are outside of the norm in terms of university-industry collaborations. So one of them has to do with contracting, which I think is a big issue, and that has to do with looking differently at the way intellectual property is treated in contracts. And so several years ago, Penn State University looked at their portfolio. A gentleman by the name of Hank Foley, who had Sue's position at Penn State, he noticed that they had very little intellectual property revenue and had a lot of sponsored research dollars, and yet he was getting a lot of complaints from companies saying that it was taking too long to put these contracts into place. And so Hank made a very bold decision that said, you know what, we're going to monetize the foreground intellectual property in our sponsored research agreements and remove that as an issue if companies are willing to pay a technology fee up front. And I'm not really here to go into all the mechanical aspects of it, but what I will tell you is that was a fundamental change in the way that universities would negotiate contracts with companies. And so Hank deserves a lot of credit. Now the problem, of course, is Penn State was the pioneers. And what happens to pioneers? Right? You want to be a settler. So I think a lot of universities are looking at the Penn State experiment, the Minnesota experiment, and it's now evolved, and there are probably 15 to 20 universities that are out front now that have adopted this model that Penn State kicked off. And so I think it's been a real game changer. I think if you talk to some of the large company folks in here that do university contracting, they'll tell you that there's been a change with those schools, but also other schools learning from that. So I think that's something that's out there that's a change. I think you can look at changes to tenure and promotion for faculty members. You know, at universities, faculty members are judged based upon whether or not they can get tenure, even in today's world. And the question is, how do you evaluate and look at industry funding from a company to a faculty member? How does that rate relative to a federal contract or a federal grant? And for historical reasons, intellectual property developed through invention disclosures or through sponsored research agreements with companies has not been considered to be as valuable as, say, a grant from NSF or NIH or from other federal agencies. And that's starting to change by schools within universities. And so Texas A&M is a good example, where in the engineering school, they have taken into account industry-sponsored research dollars as an explicit criteria for tenure and promotion. So that will affect change in the academy if that is evaluated, and it really needs to be evaluated on a college-by-college basis. So that's another, what I would call, impactful change that we're seeing out there. Some schools are looking at doing auctions of their intellectual property that's sitting on the shelf, so to speak. Those models and examples that have been out there have not generated a lot of revenue, but what it has done is it has allowed some schools to reduce their patent costs because they could go back to a faculty member after they've done these patent auctions and said, you know what, we spent $30,000 protecting your intellectual property over the last 4 years. We put it out into the marketplace. We did this auction. Nobody wanted to buy it, and so we're going to reduce our patent costs and patent protection. So those are just some examples, I think, of what's going on in the academy. Now let me talk a little bit about what's happening in the corporate sector. And there are lots of companies doing different approaches to how they're doing academic engagement. And I don't think we should ever lose sight of the fact that the number one intellectual property being transferred from universities to companies are students, right? We should never lose sight of that. Students are the best technology transfer that ever existed, and they will continue to be. Now, that being said, there are different models that are taking place now in the corporate sector looking at ways of engaging companies. There are some companies in the information technology space that when they sign an agreement with the university, they want the university to agree to put all of the findings into the public domain. And that's not a common approach, right? Most companies traditionally have said, oh no, we want you to protect that and then give us first rights. But now what we're seeing is some companies saying, you know what, we want you to put that in the public domain. We don't want to worry about patent costs and we don't want to worry about litigation. That's really a different approach. And we've actually seen some federal agencies like the National Science Foundation say, you know what, we're going to make that an option for some of our center agreements, like through the IUCRC program. In fact, Ohio State is part of an IUCRC that has that as an option for companies that join their center. So once again, that's kind of changing the playing field. And lastly, I think if we talk about the triple helix, the government role in this is really changing. And so, for most universities, the bread and butter in terms of standards as it relates to research has always been federal grants. And what we're seeing today is, especially for large awards, and Larry's going to talk about his center, and I think you'll hear it in greater volumes from him, about the importance of industry engagement to achieve federal support. So if you look at the Engineering Research Center program, which I think is a really good example from the National Science Foundation, that's in phase 3 now. In phase 1, when you submitted an application, they encouraged you to work with industry. In phase 2, it said you must work with industry. In phase 3, which is the current phase, you must have cash from companies to support your center to be eligible for submitting an application, right? So if you care about federal funding, and that's the most important lifeblood for universities, and you want to continue to get large awards, then industry engagement is going to be increasingly important. So I think those are some of the changes that we're seeing in terms of university industry engagement from those 3 different sectors, both the government, the private sector, and the university sector. And I'll just make one other last comment, and then I'll turn it back over to Sue. And that is to say, I think states are really our incubators for transformative change in terms of university industry engagement. And I think Ohio has really been leading in that space. I think if you look with the Edison Centers, the Third Frontier program, and some of the other things, the state of Ohio has been willing, as have other states, to make direct investments as well as provide direct support to encourage engagement between the industry and the academic sectors.
Great. Thank you very much. Next up is Larry Brown. Larry has more than 30 years of aerospace and marine experience in materials joining. Throughout this time, he's gained working knowledge in various joining processes for metal alloys, both lightweight and high-temperature superalloys. His efforts have led to advanced joining methodologies for fabrication of advanced military and commercial engine hardware and have yielded 6 patents as co-inventor. As the executive director of the American Lightweight Materials Manufacturing Innovation Institute, or ALMI, Mr. Brown is responsible for day-to-day management and leadership of the organization, including interface with the Office of Naval Research's Contracting Officer's Technical Representative. Larry?
Thank you very much. If we could, I'd like to go ahead of the one slide that I have. I just want to go ahead and throw that up there, if it's possible. Thank you. Yes, as mentioned here, I am the executive director of basically a new initiative, a new way of doing things as it relates to technology development and in manufacturing for our American industry. I really have to thank the administration that's existing today, the president and others, and having the thought of wanting to go ahead and trying to see what can we do with our manufacturing base. We've gotten away from manufacturing over the years. And when we look at manufacturing, manufacturing has been an enabler to our economy. It has been, in my mind, the thrust for the innovation that has been created within this country to get us to where we're at today and where we can continue on in the future. But we've gotten away from that, and that we don't tend to think of manufacturing anything today, where we tend to think of manufacturing as being the 3 Ds, dangerous, dumb, and dirty. And let's face it, if we were to ask folks out here in this audience here, if I were to survey you, if you were to ask your kids, your sons or daughters, and you're trying to go ahead and send them in a direction of which way they should go for their careers, how many of you would tell them that they should be manufacturers? Can I see a show of hands? How many? Yes. You can understand the state that we're in right now as a country. And I'm one of those. My parents wanted to make sure that I got an engineering degree. But you know, not everybody is meant to be an engineer. I hate to say that, but not everybody is meant to be. And there's a lot of valuable assets that we have in our people in this country to be able to work in a manufacturing environment. And that, again, that is where the innovation spawns. This is what has brought about these new institutes that are being set up around the country. The very first institute that was set up was there in Youngstown, Ohio, being that of America Makes. And its technology is in 3D manufacturing or 3D printing. They were the pilot. And I must thank the director there, Ed Morris, for his, let's say, trials and tribulations that he has gone through at trying to bring this public-private collaboration together. It is really a challenge when you think about it, and Tony has mentioned this, when you bring your academics, your industry, and the government all to the same table. There's no recipe, there's no cookie cutter method of being able to go ahead and bring such a collaboration together. But that doesn't mean you don't try to go out and you try to do it. It is needed, and we need to be not just innovative in our technologies, but also innovative in contracting mechanisms, the way that we approach business here along the way so that we are improving actually the goodness of our entire manufacturing base, which then provides a great economic thrust here for that of our country as well. Myself, I am with what is known as the Lightweight Materials Institute. We've seen that there is a need that we cannot forget about things that we're doing in metals in this country. And let's face it, metals are pervasive. Everywhere you turn, there's going to be metals. Yes, there are composites and other materials as plastics, but metals are going to go ahead and continue to be around, not for today, but for tomorrow as well. And so how do we make best use of some of those metals? How can we make best use of the manufacturing processes that go along the way? That's what my institute is about. It is a public-private collaboration wherein we have brought in right now 82 members as of last week. And they spread the entire gambit of industry, academia, our government partners. When I look at industry, we're looking at the large OEMs as well as the small startups. And let's face it, the startups are usually the businesses that really major in innovation. They have a new product, they have a new ideal that the OEMs can use. So we've gotten them into the whole ecosystem of doing business. Looking at my academic partners, right now there are 21 partners, and Case Western is one of our partners equally as well, based upon some of the materials expertise that they have here as well, and we wanted to bring them on board equally as well. And I must say my alma mater, The Ohio State University, also is involved in our institute as well as being part of the 21 academic organizations that we have in play. When we look at some of the organizations that come into play and some of our partners, the states are key in this as well. And Tony has alluded to that as well. Some of these innovations that we're looking to do to bring forward, we're looking to have economic impact. And what better way to be able to define the economic impact that we're looking to have and to achieve is partnering with the states through the various workforce, education, intermediaries along the way, so that not only do we develop technology, we want to transition the technology equally as well. You see, when I'm working with technology out of our institute, I'm operating at what is known as a manufacturing readiness level of 4. That's where I start. And I try to take technology from that of the seed beds of that you find in our university partners and be able to connect the dots to try to find the actual application in industry. I hate to say that sometimes in our university environments, we have a lot of great ideas and they just sit there. They sit in the sandbox. And we need to be able to have industry and connect industry with some of those late-breaking developments along the way. But at the same time, industry, they do not want to take a risk on something that they really know nothing of. It sounds good, it may even smell good, might have even gotten a little taste of it, and it tastes pretty good. But it is very risky for an OEM to take on something brand new that they have no data up on. That is where the Institute stands. It stands in that gap to be able to take late stages of technology that has a glimmer of an ideal in application. We have some material property data. I've got industry sitting over here thinking, you know, I might be able to use that. I'm using the federal dollars to serve as a bridge, as a gap, to minimize the risk of industry embracing technology that is coming up out of the universities. And I'm doing it in a pre-competitive type of an environment, meaning that I'm bringing in several industries all together at one time to maybe help develop a certain type of new technology, looking at the use of a new metal for a given application. Again, it makes it less risky in coming into play. It's a way that our university partners can actually meet up with industry. And as a matter of fact, if I were to digress just a bit, the university partners that we have involved, they were more concerned about the relationships with industry. They're realizing that things are changing. They're not getting grants specifically just to do research for the sake of research. It's got to be very applied these days. And some of the universities are making that switch at trying to be more applications oriented than just having some other ideal and not knowing where it's going to go. So our partners came together from a university standpoint with the ideal of, I want to be in connection with industry. I want to try to understand industry better. Not every university is alike when it comes to understanding industry and their needs, and that they must move at the speed of business, not necessarily at the speed of one quarter, one semester, next one along the way. You see, industry, they've got products they want to produce, and they want to produce them now. They don't want to wait 3, 4, 5, 10 years. That's gone. And so universities have to change a little bit of their model to be able to have technology that is directed with linkages to industry. And that's what we're trying to do, is to help to facilitate, provide that linkage so that we can pull that innovation forward and try to connect the dots into industry so that we truly transition at the end of the day. So I've talked about technology, I've talked about transition, but also of equal importance in this collaboration is that of workforce education and development along the way. What good is it to have new technology and it may be great? And we're looking at how we transition it, but you will fail in the workplace if you don't have the right folks to be able to embrace that technology and they move with the technology. See, we're not looking at trying to displace workers, but we're wanting them to grow with the technology equally as well, so that they too become really happy with their jobs. They become enamored with the technologies that they're working with, maybe that new robot, that new 3D printing machine. We want their talents to grow with that equally as well. That is the only way that we're going to be innovative at being able to improve our entire ecosystem in this country. So I'm not going to go ahead any further. I'll leave it for some other questions and comments along the way. But I just wanted to give you an idea of this is a national institute, and we're trying to have impact across this country. I'm based out of the Midwest here initially here, out of the 5 states. So I'm going to be very relevant into my 5 states of Michigan. And I have to say that state up north there, Michigan, wow, that's a tough one for me. But nonetheless, Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee, that is a fertile bed of metalworking technology, and that's where I will be able to have the initial impact. And yes, I do look to expand beyond that because I want to be relevant to the entire country. Do we have the right model of trying to bring folks together in this collaboration? I don't know. I'm still a pilot. And to Tony's point that he made earlier, getting the agreements in place between my 21 academic partners, my industry partners, whether they're the OEMs down to the startups as well as government, that's where I spent at least my first 9 to 10 months just trying to negotiate agreements that everybody could agree to in coming into play. So we do have our challenges, we do have work ahead of us, but we can't be afraid, we can't say no, we can't say we turn up our nose. Let's help ourselves out across this landscape, because if we don't do it, I'm sorry, we'll be beholden to other nations at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. Next, we're going to hear from Dave Martin. Dave is the founder, president, and CEO of Intwine Connect, LLC, where he's responsible for driving corporate strategy, business development, partner relationships, technology development, and finance. Since founding Intwine Connect in 2008, Dave has been instrumental in defining the company's primary platform technology and solidifying and implementing key partnerships with organizations such as the Schools of Medicine and Engineering at Case Western Reserve University, the Northeast Ohio Public Energy Council, and the Verizon Partner Program. Dave has a bachelor's degree in management science from Westminster College in New Wilmington, Pennsylvania, and an MBA from Case Western Reserve University. Dave?
Thanks, Sue, and good afternoon. So I was thinking through the questions that we were given about changes in industry and universities and the partnerships and how that works out, and then models as to what is going on now and what could go on in the future. So I'm going to just maybe talk through, if you could allow me, my career a little bit, because I think there are some pieces of it that might be relevant. So I started in the semiconductor industry in 1985 and in sales. And at that time, salespeople went to business school and engineers went to engineering school. So what happened in the semiconductor industry and electronics overall is products became much more differentiated. So you weren't selling commodity memory and components to companies. You had to understand the technology well enough in the sales process to be able to engage with an engineer. You weren't calling on buyers anymore. So what the industry started to migrate towards is hiring engineers to be in sales. And that was a pretty big shift in the 80s when hardware technology started to become much more integrated and complex. So the challenge there for industry was to go to universities, and I was in this challenge, as a sales organization, try and hire engineers to get into sales. And that was a non-starter. Universities you were on the dark side. That was not an option. Professors would not let us in the building. Universities would not welcome us to recruit their students. It just wasn't in their DNA. They were either in research or you're going to go get an engineering job. And that's kind of the way the industry progressed. And it was pretty interesting where part of my career, I was a sales manager in Chicago, and I went to the University of Illinois, and I worked for Texas Instruments. And we used to go as a management team into the school, so you'd have TI day, and all the engineering managers would go in, and I was going as a sales manager. And even when I would talk with the engineering managers before we would go and meet the students, they would just ridicule me. What are you doing talking to engineers? You should be over in a business school. I had to sit at the kids' table. It wasn't real. So what was interesting, though, what happened, and we used to do this as a sales organization, we used to go with the engineering managers because at least we could see students. So what we never really told them is what we used to say is it's basically, supply and demand. There's a big demand for technical people who want to sell. So if you had somebody in front of you that you thought was going to make it, and it was a lot of the characteristics that are talked about now in this concept of entrepreneurship, yesterday was referenced to be in sales, to be determined. We had this little graph that said, if you go take a job as an engineer, your salary is going to grow. It'll start higher, it'll grow, and then it'll flatten out. And if you start in sales, your salary is going to be low, your salary is going to just exponentially grow. And more likely than not, the engineers are going to be working for you. And if you track the history of the semiconductor industry, that's somewhat what happened. It became much more of an industry that was the mixture of this, what everyone calls entrepreneurship. Now, understanding the customer, understanding the technology, and being able to dig in and actually design circuits. So what happened then in the semiconductor, and then the semiconductor industry started to catch on, and it became more accepted for that to happen. In my career, what I did then is I left Texas Instruments because the sales rep industry had not followed suit. It was really kind of still an older mom and pop little companies who had commodity salespeople calling on buyers. So we jumped in there big, we scaled it, we did the same thing that we wanted to do that Texas Instruments did. We went into universities and hired engineering students. Backtrack a little bit, when I lived in Cleveland and I wanted to recruit at Case. And at that time, universities were either you educate for a job or you educate for research. And Case was an educate for research. So we didn't recruit at Case back then. So so many years later, I get into the sales rep business, and now I'm going out and hiring students. So I said, I'm going to give Case a shot. Why not? So I came in, and in that case, it wasn't this hostile relationship at all, but it was, okay, here's career, where you go when the resumes are posted. So, and I hired 2 engineers who are partners in my sales rep firm and doing extremely well. So I was able to prove that was, that you could do it. And it was another interesting point. This is something that, again, I'm not sure how relevant it is or not, but I would say you got a BSEE from Case Western Reserve University. Okay, that's enough. I mean, you made it, right? You got through. So I would start reading the resume from the bottom up. Did you play sports? Did you do something different that made you a well-rounded graduate? And you were competitive, and you were determined, and you didn't, I'm not saying just study, but it needs to be more than that. I mean, certainly brilliant people who invent things, the world needs them. But in this kind of atmosphere, it takes a little more than that. And we work through that. So what then happened in the semiconductor industry is, the offshoring. Manufacturing went first, and then design engineering started to go. And you're selling to design engineers, and you're like, oh my gosh, my customers are, my account base is shrinking. So we decided that we wanted to start a product company, and we started Intwine Connect in 2008. And we were going to go after this IoT space. And I don't want to get into IoT because I know there's another conference on it here. But what we did is we jumped in to be a module supplier, right? We were going to be a module supplier to OEM companies because we knew them all. We were calling on them. I mean, Aclara, Rockwell, I mean, they're all our customers, right? So we're saying, well, they want to connect their product. That's the problem we're going to solve. So we're going to design a Wi-Fi module. We know Wi-Fi. We're going to sell it to them, and they're going to connect it, and we're all going to make a lot of money. Well, we made a Wi-Fi module, and we sold it, and no one knew what to do with it because you needed a whole network approach. So it's like, okay, now we're in trouble. Now we're way outside our comfort zone. We have no idea what's going on. We need help. So I actually got on the Case website, and Ed Kaner's sitting over there. I called Ed in the STEP program and said, this is what we're doing. And he's like, wow, come on down. And I'm like, what? Come on down, hire physics kids. They're great. Let's go. So I went down. I presented. It was a great relationship. We've hired 3 of their students. And Ed, so this is kind of the way it happened. Ed introduced me and Bruce Terry introduced me to Joe Jankowski. I got to meet Joe, who introduced me to Ted Theophrastus, who's my IP attorney. And then the discussion started to be, this needs to be a network. So we need to understand how to do hardware design, firmware design, embedded Linux design, cloud computing, apps, analytics, everything. And they're like, oh, well, let's go meet Ken Laparo, Dr. Laparo. This would be interesting. So I went in engineering, and it was like, open the doors. This is interesting. Let's come in. Let's talk about it. Because if you look at that space, it overlays the whole EECS curriculum and agenda, and everybody could participate. So we all put our heads together and said, rather than do an incremental change, why don't you come down on campus and have space in the engineering building? And we do. We have labs and space in the engineering building at Olin. And the model was 3 things. One was to engage students, and just not PhD students and graduate students, but research for undergrads was a need that the university had for recruiting and engage students early on. And we've done that. We've engaged students not only from engineering, but physics, English, business, so a number of the different, the medical school, a number of the different schools. And that's worked out pretty well. And it's kind of fun. You got a freshman who comes in, he's from West Coast. He's from the West Coast. And he says, I want to stay here this summer. I don't want to go home. But I need money because if I'm going to call my parents and tell them I'm not coming home, I need to pay rent. I need to do all these things. So we have this meeting. We're like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. So we figured out a way to do it. But he's here, and he wants to stay here because he's doing meaningful work, and it's an exciting market. So that's one area that I think we've got a good start, but we need to continue to push that and engage students on a more regular basis. The second piece of it is around innovation. So the discussion was, let's come up with some type of formalized relationship with the university. So we met with Michael Haig and TTO, and again, very open, and sat down, and we came up with a teaming agreement where the concept, what we did is a spin in. So we had technology, we had a market, we knew had an idea what we were doing. We were going to spin into the university, both with people and our technology, and the ability to have agreements in place. So the agreement is a teaming agreement where if we want to go after federal funding or state funding or or an opportunity in the market, we bring technology and our resources, the university brings that we go after, and we've been successful at that. We've worked with the med school on air quality monitoring. We've secured funds from the National Institute of Health, from HUD, around residential indoor air quality. We have a patent on that. We've done work in energy as well. At the Great Lakes Energy Institute, they were brought into it. We've won. We are going to be in the Department of Energy and the California Energy Commission through utilities being the brains of a microgrid, which is really super cool in solar and in battery storage and how all that's going. So that piece of it has gone well. And the other section of that relationship is IP. And so Case Western Reserve University is an equity member in Intwine. And there's an agreement that says, as we develop intellectual property together at a high level, to not get into the details of it, the university has opportunities to become more of a shareholder of Intwine, and Intwine has the opportunity to practice the technology that we jointly develop. So much more than that, you got to talk to some of the lawyers, because I'm not exactly sure of all the details of it. I'm just trying to outsell this stuff. But that's the section 2 of it, the innovation. And then the third piece of it we called celebrate. Events like this, to go out, and it has been a tremendous help for Intwine to be associated with the university in terms of credibility with customers. We've had Fortune 100 customers into Olin, and from all over the world, China, all over the US, Europe. And when you're there, they're like, gosh, this works. This makes sense. You're not 5 people in a suburban office complex trying to make this work. This makes sense to me. So it has clearly helped us, and I hope to think it's helped the university. And obviously the goal long term is we're going to spin out. And when we spin out, we've all had this conversation, all the folks involved. I want to stay close to the university. It'll be office space near the university. We want to continue to scale it. We want to get to revenue and get people to buy our stuff and not worry about an exit strategy, and keep hiring students and keep developing and innovating, and then figure out where it takes us all. So that's kind of our story, and I'm sure there'll be questions that come up, but that's it.
Great. Thank you very much. And last, but definitely not least, we have Dr. James Chmiel. Dr. Chmiel is a professor of pediatrics in the Division of Pediatric Pulmonology and Allergy Immunology at Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine and Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital Case Medical Center. His research involves understanding the inflammatory response of the lung, particularly as it relates to cystic fibrosis and asthma, and the impact of anti-inflammatory therapeutics upon this response. He's published several papers in both areas. Dr. Chmiel received his BS from the University of Notre Dame and his MD PhD from the University of Michigan. There's that Michigan word again. He completed his pediatrics residency at Children's Memorial Hospital, Northwestern University Medical School, and his pediatric pulmonology fellowship at Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital, Case Western Reserve University, where he's been on faculty since 1998. Currently, Jim is the Associate Director of the Leroy W. Matthews Cystic Fibrosis Center, the Director of the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation Therapeutics Development Center at Case Western Reserve University Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital, and the Director and Chief Executive of the Ohio Clinical Trials Collaborative, or OCTC. Jim?
Sure. So thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Because I went to medical school, we have slides. That's how they trained us. So I'm in this. So could you put up my first slide,
Sure.
Sue?
Here, you want to drive?
Yeah. So I am the chief executive and director of the OCTC, and really it should be investigator, because this is an experiment on the statewide level, and this started a few years ago. Governor Kasich gathered the CEOs of many of the major hospitals, the presidents of the universities, and the deans of the medical schools, and said, we have a unique opportunity here in the state of Ohio. You know, I look around the country, and we have some of the finest medical research institutions in any state in the country, but you're all working independently, and so I want you to start working collaboratively. and they talked about the different areas, and one of them was to build this statewide clinical trials network, and he turned to Dean Davis here at Case Western Reserve and said, Dr. Pam, I'd like you to run this, and of course no one tells the governor no. And so I've known Pam. I came here in 1995, and Pam was my division chief during my fellowship, and we've known each other. And so I was in my office minding my own business, and then Pam asked me to come to her office and was laying this out, and it's, oh, it's gonna be great. We got opportunity for you like you can't believe, and this thing is already, it's everybody's on board and it's set up, and don't worry, it's gonna be fantastic. And so I said yes, and knowing full well I had zero business background. I had one business class in my entire life. That was accounting as a senior, and I took that pass-fail. And it was not a real accounting class, it was accounting for non-business majors. So I had no business background, had no idea, and for 6 months I was the Ohio Clinical Trial Collaborative. And as I would go around the state and visit the different institutions, I would learn that there is no agreements anywhere. And so with that background, I'll go a little bit of what the Ohio Clinical Trials Collaborative is and how we built this network. And it's still very much an experiment, and it's changed. We had what's called a pivot in the business model, which I found out means your first thing's not working, so you better come up with a second idea. So anyway, it was launched in 2014. As I got involved in May 2013. And what they decided to do, the plan was, for those of you who don't know, the NIH has these large infrastructure grants called the Clinical Translational Science Awards. And they're pretty difficult to get, and they're pretty difficult to maintain. And Ohio had 3 of them. There was one here at Case Western Reserve University in Northeast Ohio, Ohio State in Columbus, Central Ohio, and then University of Cincinnati in Southwestern Ohio. So we had a nice corridor there, and then all the hospitals associated with those universities were part of that. So they were using this as a backbone, but the governor made it very clear he didn't want this to just be those institutions. He understood that that's where it was going to have to start necessarily, but he wanted it to branch out and include other universities and hospitals across the state. And our goal, of course, the governor cares, what he wanted to do is the thought was at the time, bring more clinical trials here, just get more patients enrolled in these clinical trials. Companies will invest in the state of Ohio. We'll get more jobs, and so that's going to benefit the state of Ohio. So these are the founding members. The universities, as I said, were the 3 CTSA universities, but then we have collaborating universities as well that we're working with: University of Akron, Wright State, and University of Toledo. And then here are the hospitals which we have agreements with. So the 3 hospitals here in Cleveland, University Hospitals, Cleveland Clinic and Metro. In Columbus, we have Ohio State Medical Center, and Nationwide. Cincinnati is the Children's Hospital, and the University of Cincinnati Medical Center. And you can see the other hospitals. Most of them are associated with universities, but some aren't. And we felt that this was imperative because there's certain things that the hospitals associated with the CTSAs are interested in, but there's things that the larger hospitals that aren't associated with some of the universities are interested in and do better than we do, frankly. And so we thought it was important to bring these other groups in. And so this is kind of the therapeutic development process. It takes 10 to 15 years to bring a new drug to market, and it costs $1 to $2 billion. And so when we first started out, we went out and thought, okay, people are going to want to do clinical trials. This is what I am. I'm a clinical trialist. I spend most of my time doing clinical trials in asthma and CF. One of the reasons the dean asked me to do this, I think, is when you work in an area like cystic fibrosis, which was termed an orphan disease, there's only 30,000 people in the United States and 70,000 people worldwide, you have to work with industry in order to help your patients. NIH funding, pay line's 8% if you're lucky, but you cannot get therapeutics to your patients unless you work with industry. And so I understood that early on in my career. You kind of come out of medical school, and like some people have pointed out, the other panelists, is there's kind of academia and there's kind of industry, and never the twain shall meet. But I couldn't do that in my career, and so I knew it was important in order, one, to support my research and my research team, we had to have these industry partnerships, and ultimately, this is how the drugs were going to get to my patients. And when you have a disease where the life expectancy now, we're thrilled it's up to 39 years. When I got into this, it was in the low 20s, and being much older than 39, believe me, that's still not good enough, and we have a long way to go. So I understood, and I had a good working relationship with the pharmaceutical industry and biotech. And so I think that's one of the reasons Dean Davis asked me to head this up. And so the problem with the clinical trial concept is we go out, we'd find, we're turning over rocks. We had no direction, and we're turning over rocks. And as we're talking to these companies, we're going back, and we realize this network where everybody's on board had no agreements anywhere. So first, there wasn't even agreements amongst the 3 founding institutions about how this is going to be done: Case Western, Ohio State, and Cincinnati. So we thought, geez, we ought to have an agreement amongst the 3 founders. And so we got those done. And then we took advantage of what was called the Reliant IRB that was developed here in Cleveland, where one of the things that holds up the startup of studies is IRB approval, and every institution submits it, and then it takes anywhere from 4 weeks if you're lucky to 6 to 8 to 12 weeks to get these IRBs approved. What these institutions already had was they had a Reliant IRB, meaning if we're all doing the same clinical trial, then we'll rely on your review, and then we'll just abide by it. And because we all have the same goal, and that's to protect the safety of the patients. And so we may see things a little differently than you, but overall, we're doing the same job, so why have all these reviews? And so now what happens is there's one, for example, we did it for one of my CF trials. Cincinnati Children's Hospital was the administrative site. They put in the IRB, and university hospitals relied on it. They didn't go through their process. They abided by Cincinnati. So that's very important for early phase studies. And then the other things that these institutions realize is for the later phase 3 studies, the studies are so vetted by the time they get to you and gone through so many iterations, there's so much safety data that they were bogging down the IRBs at the institutions, which really should be focusing on the early phase studies where there's not as much safety data. So then they started saying, you know what, we can send these to central IRBs and external IRBs because they do a good job too. There's good people on those. And we have less safety concerns. And so that really started to speed things up. So that was hugely important. But then we had no way to share data. There was no common CDA. So we thought, well, geez, the next thing we have to do is we have to come up with an agreement that allows us to sign one CDA. So if I get approached by a company, I can share it with people at the different institutions without, even though it's only a couple of days, without slowing up the process. So then we got that done. And then we realized we had no research agreements between anybody. So we're trying to build the airplane while we're flying it. And so we had no research agreements. So then we went around and made research agreements between the various universities. And I'll come back to that in a second. And then we had to say, well, geez, between the hospitals, we now have to have clinical trial agreements. So we better go out and make all these clinical trial agreements. So we kept the attorneys very busy, especially, I don't know if Michelle Krantz is here, but poor Michelle here at Case Western. Every other day, it seems like we were sending her some other document to review and revise. But the biggest challenge for us is, I had this vision, man, we're going to have one agreement, we're going to sign it, and boom, it's going to be done. And then you start talking to the institutions and the attorneys at the institutions, and you realize, holy smokes, this is not going to be easy because the attorneys don't really care about the network, right? Their job's to protect the institutions, and no one wants to budge. So the biggest sticking point was the intellectual property wording. When you have a private university and public university, and Ohio State's a whole different ball of wax. We just said, we're never going to get this done unless we take the IP language out. And so what we did is we took the IP language out to get the single contracting, and then we then allow those universities, once we set up the arrangement, to make an agreement regarding IP language independently. That wasn't my ultimate goal, but it was the only way to move this project forward, or it was just never going to get done. And so we would go out and find these trials, and we'd bring them back, And most of them were phase 3, some late phase 2 studies. And the problem is we take them to the investigators, and either they already knew about the study and were involved, or they had no interest in doing that study, or they felt the study, there was a reason we were getting them, and it's because they could not get those studies filled out at their current sites. And so this became a real challenge for us. And from the university standpoint, the investigators at the university, when you're on a large phase 3 study, you're probably not going to be the author of the paper. You get an acknowledgement, so you get no academic coin for your promotion. It's not your idea, and those studies often distract you from your pet projects that you're working on. And the hope was, well, if we bring enough studies, clinician educators who we could buy some of their time out of the clinics and have them become investigators. The problem with that was they weren't trained to do studies. They were trained to be clinician educators. But also it wasn't enough. So, 10%, that's an afternoon a week. That's not enough to do research. And so we were having problems with this. And then one of the governor's charges was we had to become sustainable. They gave us a small amount of seed money. We had to become sustainable. And some of the larger pharma companies, Novartis and Pfizer, and then also some of the larger CROs, they saw us as a site-finding organization. And yes, thanks, that's helpful. You saved us some time, but we're not going to pay you anything for that because we can do that on our own. We have the infrastructure. So this is when we pivoted our business model. We realized where we were going to make a difference is as we started looking at smaller firms that didn't have that infrastructure and didn't have that access to the investigators and didn't have access to samples and who needed help with designing their protocols, who, quite frankly, we were looking for some that still needed preclinical development because then that gets the basic science investigators jazzed, and they were willing to pay for it. For example, we're working with a company now, and this person used to be very high up in a major pharmaceutical company, and his great frustration is, and he believes in what this smaller firm's doing, is he doesn't have the infrastructure. So he says, I will gladly pay you to do this for me. And so what we did is so this is why we pivoted the business model. And we've got much better response from the investigators because now they have input into the design of these. And so we offer a full line of services. And so we can start in the preclinical area and help them develop their projects. We work with the med school, but also biomedical engineering. But we also have things that these smaller companies don't have. All these institutions have services that write IRBs. It can fill out IND paperwork to file with the FDA. And so that's huge. The other thing that we can get from these institutions is they all have tissue biorepositories. But they were just sitting there collecting them, sitting in freezers, -80 freezers. Industry is clamoring for this stuff. And so we said, listen, we'll move this stuff for you, and so let's we'll get industry because they need this to develop assays and to study their product, and so we started the tissue biorepository case or at UH hadn't moved samples in months, and they literally said in the last month we moved more samples than the previous 3 years in 1 month because we were able to find industry that needed their samples. And so we have this. And then we have the expertise at these smaller, or not at the academic, to do the phase 1, phase 2 studies. But then when those studies get so large, we can now spread them out to the other hospitals in the state to do the larger phase 3 studies. And that's in their wheelhouse. That's what they like doing. They don't want to do the phase 1 or early phase 2 studies. They want the late phase 2 and phase 3 studies. So we mesh very nicely. And so if you look at this slide here, the other thing we did is we realized that some of these smaller firms didn't have certain areas. And so we set up relationships with the CROs in Ohio and some other things that they would need in order to develop their product and to help slow them, to help speed this up and not slow them down. We formed an agreement with Pacific GMP, which does biologic productions. There's only 2 in the country, and so we have an agreement with them that we can offer to these smaller biotech firms so they can get their product developed. And so this is just many of the things I just talked about and how we can support it. And it's still very much, as I said, an experiment. I have no idea what's going to happen in the next year or two. But I think we're on a much safer ground, and we found really our niche. But many of the things that we've already heard about still remains the hurdles, the intellectual property, getting academia to move at the speed of business. Our business people, they just pull their hair out. Why is it taking so long to get these things through? And so we have changed mentality, and because this is new for the university as well, and they've actually changed some of the things and how they process things in order to speed them up.
Great, thank you. Let's thank all of our panelists. So now we're entering the question and answer period of the session, and to get the conversation started, I'm going to ask the first couple questions, but I see your digital questions are rolling in, and we also have a microphone available here up front for anybody who would prefer to use the old-fashioned way. So I'm just going to begin by asking any of our panelists to answer the question, if you could change one thing in your organization or sector to improve its innovative capabilities, what would that be? Who wants to begin?
So I'll just jump in. Today last couple of days talked about innovation being an invention that somebody's going to buy. Well, again, I think there are incredibly smart folks around here who could commercialize whatever you want to commercialize. The question is, what do you want to commercialize? So the answer is to understand what that market need is well enough where you're at least close when you start deploying resources on it. I think that's always the critical challenge and what we need to continue to work on and continue to try and improve. And again, I'm trying to build an organic organization from the ground up, and I think one of the areas where what we try and build as a culture, and some of the grads will come in and on one of the first few days, if they're in this role of trying to understand industry and trying to understand what the need is, the conversation goes something like, imagine yourself being as aggressive as you could possibly be, and that's not going to be aggressive enough. So be aggressive in the way you ask questions, in the way you try and understand the market needs, but obviously be respectful about it. So I think that's kind of that engine of innovation is how to understand that customer need, and it's an art, and really get good at understanding that.
Anyone else want to take this question on? Yeah, Jim.
Yeah, so the biggest thing that we faced initially was trust. We had these institutions that grew up independently. They had no intention of collaborating, and have been fierce competitors for the clinical dollar. And so to get them, and part of the problem is though we have, the grant from the state runs through Case Western. We have maintained that, we represent the state, but, outside of Cleveland, it's still like, well, this is a Case Western thing, and so can I trust them? And then a little bit in Case Western, it's like, well, they're an Ohio thing. Can I trust them to have case best interest? And so getting the institutions to trust each other, and then also being willing, when we started approaching about the different contracts and CDAs, we'll do that, but you're going to use our language, Yep. And so finally breaking those barriers down, and it was a lot of running your head into the wall, trying to say, no, can we come to some common agreements here? And over time, then the trust built up, but it's still tenuous, to be honest. And so we still work on it because, and again, Chmiel's down at Ohio State. How do I know he's not going to give away some of our trade secrets, or to Case or UH or Cleveland Clinic? And so those are the things that we have to, our continual challenge.
Yeah.
Great. Anyone else want to chime in on this one?
Yeah, if I might go ahead and comment. I think what our collaboration as leaders, when we came together to try to understand the formation of these new institutes that are popping up, we had to come to the realization that we don't know what we don't know. And there are many assumptions that get made along the way when you're trying to jump out and do something good. Then you bring attorneys into the room. And I think that's what everyone here has alluded to, is that trying to make sure that we understand how this collaboration is going to work across the board. Again, I've got a collaboration of, again, 82 organizations. That means I've had 82 different attorneys to start to look at membership agreements as to how we're going to collaborate and work together. And again, there's no silver bullet that is a one-stop shop for everyone. But I know that I made some mistakes early on by making some early assumptions that I thought would work for me, but it did not work for, let's say, the other half of the organizations. So again, I didn't know what I didn't know. And if you're going to work in a collaborative environment, you must try to seek out some input from others. But at the same time, they've got to understand the shoes that you're walking in. You know, it's been said here that, you know, the universities don't quite understand the business case. And the business case, when you get with the business folks, they don't quite understand what's happening on the academic side. Well, now you throw the government into that equally as well. And trying to get everyone. It is a challenge, but I think we're starting to come through it and understand it a little bit better, that there are more things that we do know so that we can start to move at the actual speed of business, at being able to accomplish the innovative things that we want to do, and so that we don't miss some timelines, that we don't miss important targets. Otherwise, again, we will have missed the boat, literally.
So Sue, I guess I'll wrap up and maybe make just a couple observations. So I think there are a couple things, if I was a benevolent despot, if I could change, I would, right? So first is there needs to be a sense of urgency. I can't tell you how important it is that we get serious about this. You know, it's the proverbial like lobster in the pot, right? Or the frog in the pot, whatever it is. The water's warming up, and before you know it, you're going to be the meal. So it's very competitive out there. There's a lot of challenges going on around the world. Not everybody's our friend, and companies can work and go anywhere in terms of partnering with universities. It's very difficult. You know, we're here in Northeast Ohio. You tend to talk about things within the state. Companies don't think about things within the state. In fact, they don't think about things within the country. So I think you need to be thinking about having a sense of urgency and purpose. So I think that's a big issue. I think there's also this challenge, and I call it, it's a schizophrenia about university-industry collaborations. So we like the idea of them in the abstract, but when you talk about it in specifics, people get uncomfortable. And so I'll use this very quick analogy. You mentioned that you have space in the building here. This is a private university. It's a little different. If you do that at a public university and your company gets successful, somebody reads about that in the Columbus Dispatch, and if you're successful, you're in the Fortune 1000 company, they're okay with it. If you become a Fortune 100 company, somebody's going to say, well, wait a second. Why is it that the state of Ohio was in some way helping you be successful and you didn't help my company? So we had this, you know, it's the faculty member who gets a $5,000 check versus the faculty member who gets a $5 million check. We're okay with the $5,000 check, but not the $5 million check. Other countries, they have kind of an understanding about where their comfort level is. And I think we don't have that in the United States, and I think that's problematic. And then the last point I want to make, because I think it's really important, and Jim, I want to mention your group, the Therapeutic Development Network and Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. That happened because of boldness. Their leader, Bob Bell at the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, took their endowment and set up a drug discovery network across a dozen or so universities and hospitals around the country that has now led to 2 drugs that have been developed as therapies that have generated about $1 billion of revenue for the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. That wasn't incremental, that was bold, right? So it takes a lot of time to do incremental stuff. It takes just a little bit more to do bold stuff. So let's do bold stuff, not incremental stuff.
Before I ask the next question, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative here and say that what I take from all 4 of you, including when you were speaking as panelists, is that the issue of trust is really important, not only in terms of building partnerships between entities, but also trust in the sense of having faith in what you're doing being the right thing to do and being worth doing. You know, this is an important medical problem we're trying to solve. This is an important engineering problem we're trying to solve. We're trying to benefit humanity here. We're trying to improve society here. let's figure out a way to get to yes on this because everyone benefits if we can make this deal. So I think it's like interpersonal trust, but also some other kind of trust in the importance of doing the right thing. That can be a unifying way of thinking about this. So the next question is kind of like a logistical one, and that is that when you're trying to promote innovation activities in your organization, you have to balance between short-term operational needs and your long-term big goal aspirations. Do any of you have some wisdom to share about how you balance those two important objectives?
Well, I would comment that I don't know if there's any wisdom with it, but that is something that I'm wrestling with right now. What I did not expand upon with our new institute is that, yes, we are federally funded to the tune of $70 million over a 5-year period at which I must be sustainable after that time so that the federal dollars will go away. Also, to match that $70 million, there's cost share that must come to the table. And so there is another, in my case, $78 million that I had to pull in from my university partners, my industry, the various states that I'm working out of as well. My point is that I have many stakeholders, and I have to manage the expectations of everyone on a daily basis. My challenge right now is that how do I meet the expectations? How do I manage the expectations of all of my stakeholders? And I must look at both near-term as well as long-term, because I'm also looking at the viability of the institute equally as well. I must listen to my stakeholders in understanding where do they have an itch. I need to provide value for them, and that's generally in the near term. They're not going to wait on this great idea that's 4 or 5 years here down the pike. It may be fantastic, but need to show results today. I'm driven by my industry partners, and also right now I'm driven by the Office of Secretary of Defense, that they're wanting to see that I am moving forward at having some of these near-term benefits. So I've got this delicate balancing act here, that I've got to be able to look at what I need to do now to show this administration that things are going along well, but not to be blindsided from a business standpoint as to what does it take to be able to be sustainable after the 5-year period. Me personally, I'm into this for the long haul. I'm not looking for a 5-year gig. Otherwise, I could have stayed in Columbus. Woo! But the ideal here is trying to manage the expectations and let them understand what your expectations are along the way so that I can be able to address both the near-term and the long-term goals and visions at the same time. It's being transparent along the way.
Great. Anyone else want to comment on that?
I have the same setup as well, because we got seed money from the state. There's a cash and non-cash match from the institutions, and it is a difficult balancing act. We have our long-term goals, and I know if given enough runway, we can achieve those, but we got to pay attention to the short-term goals because that's how we get to the long-term goals. And I have all the institutions, the hospitals, the universities, the state, and these state contracts that they're doing are new, and the institutions are still trying to figure them out and what the cash match and the non-cash match means and all these different things. And so it's what keeps you up at night.
I guess from our organization, we're trying to integrate that in. We're trying to integrate that into our culture in a few different ways. One is to make the expectation clear, the goal clear as to what we're doing in the long term, like sell more flowers. I think that visual is just ours, is sell more gateways. So individually, then they're focused on that. If something urgent comes up, they could figure it out. I mean, they can make that judgment, and they might be right and they might be wrong, but make a decision and move on. And I think that's the way we try and handle it on an individual basis. So part of it is workforce development, so make sure you're hiring the people that you trust to be able to make that decision and let them make that decision and not get caught up in all the noise. If I get hit with something that I think is urgent, I'm really careful not to make it urgent to anyone else unless I absolutely believe it has to be. And that's hard, but I think that's the way we try and handle it.
Anything to add, Tony?
I mean, I think having big, hairy, audacious goals is great, but you have to have successes in between, because you can't get groups of 82 organizations to collaborate and say 5 years from now we're going to celebrate a victory. You have to have 6-month or 9-month wins to keep people involved.
Yeah. And the other thing I'm hearing from your responses is that you have your own short-term goals and demands, you have your long-term aspirational dreams, and then you have these other externally imposed expectations along the way, some of which may be short-term and some of which may change your path, cause you to pivot. Okay, great. We have some questions coming in from the audience, which is wonderful. I'm going to read one of these and ask our panel to answer, and then if anybody else wants to chime in, they should go ahead and use the technology, the remesh technology. The first one is, how can you streamline all these processes? It seems like both industry and universities need each other, so how do we better bring them together?
I'd love to answer that question. So how do you streamline it? I think it's pretty simple. We were talking about this in the room earlier. You need to have the decision makers clearly articulate to the people that work for them what their vision is and what they're willing to accept. And so, I won't tell you the company, but a colleague of mine who used to do academic relations used to say he used to have to talk to 9 people at a university to tell them no before he found the person who could tell them yes. And so, and by the way, companies are guilty of this too. So it's not just universities. That being said, when I worked at a university, not here in Ohio, but at another university, and I had signatory authority like Sue does, I remember we did a deal. We hired a faculty member from a disc maker, and they were based in Pittsburgh, and he was coming down in August. It was April. They wanted to continue his research. I flew up. We had dinner at a nice Italian restaurant. We got together the next day, and I said, I don't have a return on my ticket. I'm going to stay here as long as it takes to work out a deal, and I can sign. So we'll work it out. I'll stay as long as needed, and it'll be done. So, having people who can make decisions, clearly articulate to the transactors what they're willing to do, will get things done a lot quicker. The problem is we don't clearly articulate what our comfort zone is in those multiple levels. And so we keep going back and forth, and until it's the crunch of the push time. We talked about this in the prep room before we came in. I see this all the time where a university and a company are negotiating over some deal, space, research-sponsored research, intellectual property. The company and the university will be negotiating back and forth for months, and then the company will, at some C-level, will call the university research leader and say, our funding for this goes away at the end of this week. So our fiscal year, it's going to go back to France. The mothership is going to take back the money. So we either work it out by Friday and I sign, or the deal's off. And then miraculously, the deal gets done, right? And so, I'm a chemist, not a psychologist, but it seems like this is a common challenge that we have. So why not get that understanding up front with what people are comfortable with? And if the transactors understand what the strategists want within an organization, the leaders, it'll really speed up this whole process.
Anyone else want to comment?
No, he said
Sounds
it.
right to you?
He said it, and I've got an example that I could share even with just the universities. To your point there, is that having 21 institutions coming together to work to support our institute, basically we came down to letting Ohio State and the University of Michigan carve out what that agreement should look like for all the universities. And we said, everybody else, take it or leave it. Let the big boys win. If I can get Ohio State and the University of Michigan to come together, it's got to be good for everyone else.
So, I think one way to answer this question, the question is deceptively complex, because the first part is how can we streamline, and the other part is how do we bring people together? And those aren't necessarily the same thing. I think, streamlining, taking a cold, hard look at your own internal SOPs, whether you're in business or you're in academia, and trying to figure out which are the touch points that are duplicative and don't add value and just simply slow things down, is something everybody should be doing all the time. But at least I'll say on the university side, we don't have a whole lot of slack in our system to sit around and re-examine what we do. Most of us are just treading water, maybe doing 1.5 or 2 jobs. And so finding the time to re-examine and re-engineer our internal SOPs can be challenging, but I think it's a worthwhile investment of time. So something I can volunteer that we're doing here at Case Western Reserve is we're taking a fresh look at all of the templates we use to negotiate our agreements, with an eye toward simplifying the language and making it less jargonistic and less technical, but also using it as an opportunity to be very clear with the negotiators what our intention is and say, here's our template language, this is what we want to do. But let's all talk about what would be an alternative to this that would probably be acceptable to the university also. Because we want to make sure everyone understands that, so when they're negotiating, they feel empowered when the company says we can't live with plan A, that everyone has a plan B in their back pocket that they can pull out at the ready, because we're all on the same page about what would be an acceptable plan B. And that's not an easy process, but I think it's an important process, and it's just one example I could offer. So other questions are coming in here now. Do only larger universities benefit from these types of university-industry partnerships? Most of the schools mentioned today seem to be very large schools. Yeah.
I'll take that one.
Yep.
I think that we're only going to be successful if we involve the other schools in the state and the other hospitals, because as I said, and even the private practice, we have a practice-based research network. And so that's right down to the physician office, because some of the therapeutics that need to be developed have to be done in private practices or at the community hospitals. And so the community hospitals and the smaller schools, they don't have the expertise oftentimes and to do the phase 1 studies, and there's concerns about safety. But man, they're very slick at doing the larger studies. They have patience, and so my answer, at least for what we're trying to build in the OCTC, is no. Many of the universities, we brought on Wright State, and they've been very willing collaborators. And we brought on Christ Hospital and Cincinnati and Riverside Hospital and SUMA because in Akron, because we need them to do certain things. Because a lot of these smaller, they may be smaller physically, but they got a lot of patients with certain conditions, oftentimes more than the hospitals associated with the major academic centers.
Great. Anyone else want to take this on? Examples of partnerships with smaller universities that were successful when working with industry?
Well, I think universities are not monolithic and companies aren't monolithic. Yep. So there's a big difference between a small startup versus a multinational Fortune 100 company, just like there are differences in universities. And so there's a whole lot of ways to engage across a continuum between companies and universities. And for the high-end scholarship or research that a Fortune 100 company needs to work with the university, I'll just be candid, they're going to work with a very small set of very high caliber schools. That being said, they can have a manufacturing facility in Bowling Green and need people to work on the floor plant who have engineering degrees, who are smart people. And they want to work together with that university because it helps them meet their workforce needs or helps them with advertising or communications, or you said you hire English. So on the high-end research, I think really the high-end research gets done at the best places. Not that there aren't good people at some of the smaller schools, but the concentration of the research is going to be done at the best schools. But there's a lot of other things that the quote-unquote smaller or less research-intensive schools can do to partner with large companies and small companies.
And I would add to that we're looking at partnering with many of the community colleges throughout my 5-state region equally as well, because we know that there's something that they bring to the table. And in many cases, it's in the area of the workforce education and training as well. So we want to make sure that they feel that they're on somewhat equal standing with that of the Penn States, the MITs, and the other big name universities as well.
Just maybe to add to that on the workforce development piece of it is, this whole idea of IoT and connected whatever, connected buildings, connected homes, there's been really, if you look at, there's the high voltage HVAC contractors, and then there's the home automation, low voltage. And those industries are converging. And there's a mismatch in skill sets. So there's an opportunity for disruption there. And I think it'll happen. The question's gonna be where and how. But I think that definitely is an opportunity for colleges that aren't necessarily primarily research driven, but around, like Cisco has certification programs so you can go put their routers in and go do these type of work. That I think that is definitely going to evolve and be an opportunity for universities that are in that space.
Great, thank you. I believe we have a question at one of the mics.
Hi. I am living in the science fiction world of my childhood. 2001: A Space Odyssey has come and gone. Hal is living on the internet. And I am wondering if you can figure out where I went to school half a century ago. And here's the clue. Less than 1 year after I received my Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering degree, I designed and built a machine that turned over millions of Chevrolet Power Glide transmissions from oil pan up on a diagnostics line to oil pan down where they could get hooked onto a monorail conveyor. So where did I get my engineering degree? GMI. One guy knew. Thank you. We still exist. You went there? All right, that's why. Nobody else who didn't go there knew. All right. I would go to school for 6 weeks where they would load us up with 24 credit hours of classes like calculus, calculus-based physics, chemistry, mechanical drawing, and then the next 6 weeks we would go to work in General Motors plants all over the world. And this was when General Motors was bigger than all but 5 or 6 countries on the planet until the government figured out how to destroy us, basically. But that's the model we had, and we would, during those work sessions, we would work with many GMI grads who would give us useful, very meaningful work, and we would design things and be exposed to the real life manufacturing industry where my mother worked. Actually, I'd walk up behind her with my white shirt and she'd start working like crazy until she saw she was me. But that was the model that I grew up with that no longer exists. And you're talking about collaboration between industry and academia. There's the one that I am aware of. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we've got some more questions coming in here online. Given that removal of all discovery-based research from universities would be unhealthy, what would be the right balance between use-based and discovery-based research? You stumped them. Anybody have thoughts about that?
Well, we need them both. It's just that I'm myself, from my experience where I'm at right now, that I'm put in a box to be more of the applied side of things than the discovery. And we have recognized that in the discovery stage, we do need that, but I need another funding vehicle to be able to support those types of things. We can't do away with it without it, but I've got to find another clever, collaborative way that we can fund some of the discovery types of things. Because we just don't live in today, we do look to tomorrow as well, but we've got to find clever ways of funding that. And that industry will want to fund it equally as well, because the government is not going to fund all of those things in the future. They're becoming very tight with their dollars, at least from dollars that come from the Department of Defense. They're very applications oriented, but they do have a few dollars that works within the discovery area that I'm seeing from DOD. NSF is another story.
I mean, you know, if you look historically, government support for research, which still doesn't exceed industry support for R&D, by the way, really happened after World War II and the Manhattan Project and Vannevar Bush and the Endless Frontier. You know, some people would argue that that model is not necessarily producing the true innovations that we all are benefiting from. and that, that actually privately funded research and development really does lead to innovation. Matt Ridley wrote a piece. He's in the British House of Lords. If you want to read it, it's in the Wall Street Journal on Saturday, talking about just this issue that privately sponsored research and development actually leads to more technology development, and that this love affair that we have with basic research being funded by the government leads to great technology development is actually misplaced. I'm not saying I agree with that. I just think that's an interesting point. And so it's a new model, right? It's only been around since the late 40s. Prior to that, it was really companies and philanthropy. If you were a researcher at a university, you went to a local charity or someone who you raised money by passing a hat around saying, hey, I'm doing some interesting work. Would you like to support it?
Here's another question. How can we better support faculty members who need protected time to help start new companies based on their innovations? Should we stop their tenure clocks?
I think this question's for you, Sue.
Well, we, like many universities, Case Western Reserve is right now re-examining all of our tenure and promotion policies because they historically have not rewarded entrepreneurial behavior or working with industry even to support basic research. Federal funding really was given the most favored status, and the single investigator with an R01 working in their individual lab on their individual ideas was sort of the prototype for a successful scientific career. And I think we're seeing not only are the funding streams changing in terms of demanding more interdisciplinary collaboration and team science, but also that as federal budgets contract and the whole professoriate gets more open-minded and more realistic about working with industry, we're going to have to find new ways to incentivize and reward faculty members for working with industry, for spinning off companies, for their patents, for any kind of discovery they make that doesn't sort of fit the traditional mold. But that said, taking Case Western as an example, we have 8 different schools with 8 different tenure and promotion policies. It's not even like there's one singular tenure policy that has to get dealt with. So, and I think some universities are further ahead on this and have already taken a look at that and remediated their policies, but it's not an insignificant issue. Typically, these policies have to go through a faculty senate review process, and universities are, really like deliberative governance, and there are some real advantages to that, but it does take time. It does take time. But maybe the others of you on the panel would like to comment on how can we support faculty innovators better?
Well, I think you have to look at the promotions and tenure committee. So I got off the tenure track. I went to my division chief, Pam, who's now the dean, and said, I have a lot of funding, but it is foundation and industry funding. And I have one federal grant that's a small one, and I have a family feed. I need to be promoted to associate professor, and to me, tenure became a meaningless thing. It became the certificate for being in the $6 Million Man Club because it doesn't guarantee salary. It guarantees a job. Now, Case apparently does guarantee salary, which is one of the few universities too, but it's at the lowest level, at the level you're at so as a physician, an associate professor in the English department probably makes less than I would. And so I told Pam, I said, listen, I'm comfortable coming off the tenure track. I think I can still get promoted. I do good work, and I'm not worried about tenure because, quite honestly, being in my field, I can pretty much get a job at any university in the country because I'm in a field that's underserved. So I can go Harvard, wherever. So I'm not worried about that. So, but that's not true if you're not an MD. If you're a PhD, it's very important in your field, and so they have to look at that and change. I think that's hugely important. And then there has to be creative ways to develop bridge funding for people who kind of get stuck across the abyss. And one of the things that I've met with one of the vice deans in the med school is, listen, if there's someone who needs bridge funding, we're out there meeting with these companies anyway. Tell us what they do, who needs help. The medical school doesn't have a slush fund for them, and we'll go out and find industry that they can work with to help them get over that gap. And so I think there has to be much more willingness and the understanding of the university that, not only is it good, but it's beneficial to form these relationships.
Anyone else? Okay, next question. Do universities need to have more of a sense of urgency, or is it rhetoric? I think there must be a word missing here. I think the question is, the idea that there's one entire innovation ecosystem, is that just rhetoric? Because it seems like universities are on have a different set of demands and different time frame.
I think it used to be rhetoric, but I think with the cutback in funding, the universities have realized how critical it is.
Anyone else?
Well, I think you mentioned 8 schools. I think it's different for the schools. I think you have to, what we're talking about here is not relevant to necessarily every department and every faculty member. So that's the only thing I would say. But there does need to be a sense of urgency in certain areas where I think this is relevant, this topic is relevant.
From my perspective, I am trying to impress upon my partners that there is a sense of urgency.
I guess I would just add, I'm not sure I'm far enough upstream to understand the global impact of it or the overall, but what I've seen at Case is there is a sense of urgency. Everyone gets it. It's what I said earlier. They're great students, engineering students. We've hired them. They're really super smart, but it's across all the different schools, and it does seem like that there's a sense of urgency, and there needs to be, obviously. Again, I don't know the whole nuances of government funding and where all that's going, but I would say that it's working.
Well, as your partner, we're glad to hear you feel that way. This question just came in. Where do the panelists see research funding of the future coming from for academic research? Still coming from government, coming from industry, coming from elsewhere? Anyone have a crystal ball?
Well, I don't know if it's a crystal ball. I went to Washington. I got my PhD on September 8th, 1988. Started work September 13th, 1988. And we knew exactly where the federal budget would be today in 1988, right, without changes. So the domestic discretionary budget, non-defense, used to be somewhere around 40% of the budget. It's now in the teens. So if we were looking at, how many years are we looking at?
It just said in the future.
In the future. So just project out, and if things aren't changed, the Congress, which makes decisions on less than 20 cents on the dollar, will be making decisions on a nickel on the dollar. So, the appropriators love science, but George Brown, who used to be in charge of the science committee, said, scientists don't vote and they don't contribute money to my campaigns. So you're competing against food stamps, ag support, housing, NASA, right? All these things. It's not that they're opposed to science, it's just the budget. So as it relates to the federal government, and this is probably outside the context of what this session's about, the amount of funding available for the funding agencies to support academic R&D is just going to be constrained. So without a disruptive change. And once again, just look at where the projections are, right? So I think that's just the reality of the world.
So just something maybe to looking at it locally in our experience and playing off the dynamics that happen with the federal government. And maybe this is more of what I would like to see rather than what I think is going to happen. But we talk about there's an entrepreneurial company that's engaged with the university, and there's good research and there's good economic development, and small companies create jobs. And then there are major established companies in the community, in the region. And you look at what we talked about earlier, the industrial internet, and we have the industrial piece here, and they're great companies, and we're the internet piece of it. And the university is bringing that together. So the challenge, I think, is, and the opportunity, is how do these major corporations, the connectivity is not, in our case, but it could be generalized, I think, is not a part of their core competency, but they know they need to go there. So they're wrestling with, do we do it internally? Do we do it externally? If we do it externally, how do we do it? And I work on this with Dr. Laparo. because he'll get, and with Ann, they'll get inquiries in from major companies saying, we want to partner with CASE. We'd like to build a lab. We'd like to do this. And then we get engaged in that discussion, and everybody's head starts to hurt. It's like, how does this work? Where did the funding go? What's the outcome of it? How does it all? So I think that there could be an opportunity there, and I think there's good work to do there. And that may be an area where there's opportunity to replace the government as the third leg of that stool, that it's major corporations in the community with the universities and with the startups who will fund that activity, obviously benefit from it, but be, quite honestly, more engaged and have more of a coordinated strategy about how to do that. And I think they're trying. I think that's an area that hopefully will evolve.